You know, texting a friend to let them know you're running late takes, what, maybe a second? Tops. We completely take for granted just how instantaneous communication is today. But back in the day, relaying critical information was absolutely not happening at the speed of sound. Depending on where you were and where the message needed to go, it could take a grueling 90 days on foot just to get a message from point A to point B. I mean, empires could literally rise and fall in the time it took for one single letter to cross a continent. So let's dive right into this. Welcome to today's Explainer, where we're going to look at just how far society, technology, and, well, sheer common sense have evolved. We're exploring some of history's most absolutely ridiculous jobs that just don't exist anymore. These are the wild professions that kept empires running, spirits cleansed, and wealthy people entertained. But today, they seem completely absurd. Think of this as our very own museum of obsolete careers. First up, we've got the human telegraphs. Then, dining on sins, children of the cannons, the potion tasters, and finally, human lawn ornaments. All right, Section 1, the human telegraphs, or the ancient messengers. Way before the invention of the mechanical telegraph popped up in 1837, and honestly, before boats and trains really sped things up, the absolute fastest way to get a message across a country was literally handing it to a guy and telling him to run. The earliest and most sophisticated career system of its time was built by the massive Achaemenid Empire, basically the First Persian Empire. They built this thing called the Angarium. It was an incredible 1,700-mile royal road stretching across the western half of their empire, connecting the major cities of Susa and Sardis. And get this system dropped delivery times from that 90-day foot journey down to a remarkably fast 7 to 9 days. How? They set up heavily guarded relay stations at regular intervals along the road. These checkpoints housed fresh, fully rested horses and relay messengers ready to just grab the royal documents and sprint to the next station. Anyone intercepting this line could totally devastate the empire, so it was top-tier security. Now, while the Persian Angarium relied on horses and written documents, jump forward 2,000 years to the 1500s and look at the Incan chasquis. The Inca didn't have horses, and wildly enough, they didn't have a formal written language. So their messengers, the chasquis, relied purely on their legs and their memories. We're talking running up to 5 miles at a time on wobbly stone roads, literally 10,000 feet above sea level. When a chasqui reached a weather-resistant relay hut, he would give a memorized oral performance of the king's message to the next runner, who then had to memorize it on the spot and sprint the next 5 miles. Okay, physical endurance is one thing, but what happens when you need spiritual cleansing, and a priest simply isn't an option? Like, what if you desperately needed a clean slate for the afterlife, but you had to hire someone straight off the street to do it? That brings us to Section 2, dining on sins, the 17th century scapegoats.
So the crucial point here is this bizarre kind of hocus-pocus tradition practiced from the early 17th century right up until the 19th century, primarily in England, Scotland, and Wales. The job? A sin eater. This was a person paid to ritually absorb the sins of a deceased individual by actually eating food placed upon their corpse. Basically, if you were extremely poor, a social outcast, and had absolutely no other lucrative skills, you might find yourself slapping mud outside your cottage until someone in town kicked the bucket. Because back then, standard praying and repentance weren't always considered good enough to get you into heaven. Here is exactly how this horrifying job actually worked. Step 1, a relative dies. Step 2, the family places food, usually stale bread and warm beer, directly onto the chest or face of the deceased. Yeah. Step 3, the sin eater is called into the room to literally chow down on this food, which was believed to be magically sucking up all the bad juju and wrongdoings of the dead person. Step 4, you get a paltry fee and are promptly shunned. See, while families really appreciated getting that clean slate for their loved ones, they firmly believed the sin eater retained all those absorbed sins. Because of that, these workers were deeply hated, ridiculed, and forced to live in total isolation. And this practice didn't actually die out until the early 20th century with an English farmer named Richard Munslow. Well, let's pivot for a second from the spiritual horrors of 17th century Britain. What if the danger you faced at work wasn't spiritual, but highly explosive, and you were barely old enough to attend middle school? Section 3, Children of the Cannons, commonly known as the powder monkeys. If you thought your childhood chores were rough, this is going to completely reframe your perspective. During the Age of Sail, between the 16th and 19th centuries, naval warfare was just constant. Navies desperately needed a well-supplied crew to keep their cannons firing,
And they found their labor force in the absolute most tragic of places, overburdened orphanages. As one historian captured it, these children were subjected to watching their fellow crewmen being blown to smithereens, blinded by shrapnel, and impaled, none of which they were immune to themselves. European and American navies scooped up impoverished boys, usually between 12 and 14, but guys sometimes as young as 7 years old. Because they were small and agile, their job was to run deep down into the ship's powder magazine, grab heavy leather cases of highly explosive gunpowder, and dodge cannon fire to supply the gunners on the deck. They traded their childhoods for a bed, some food, clothes, and an unimaginable amount of trauma. Thankfully, society eventually intervened. At the end of the War of 1812, the U.S. actually put regulations in place preventing the recruitment of powder monkeys under the age of 12. Britain followed suit, setting the age limit to 13. Now, sure, these restrictions were frequently ignored at first, but finally, by the mid-1800s, actual child labor laws and advancing military technology made this devastating role completely obsolete. Moving from the absolute chaos of the battlefield to the supposed safety of the doctor's office, how exactly did historical physicians diagnose what was wrong with you? Spoiler alert, it wasn't pretty. Section 4. The Potion Tasters, officially known as medieval uroscopy. Uroscopy is the art and science of diagnosing a patient by intimately examining their urine. Dating way back to the Sumerians and peaking in the Middle Ages, doctors would snoop, sniff, and sometimes sip a patient's sample, based heavily on the belief that our bodily fluids were governed by the four humors. Now, to standardize this highly subjective practice, because one doctor's yellow is another doctor's orange, uroscopists created these incredibly detailed reference guides. And this brilliantly illustrates it. If your sample was clear, the chart said you had spleen issues. Dark red, your liver is running too hot. Green meant jaundice. And if it was black, well, they pretty much determined you were facing imminent doom. But the visual check was only step one. Uroscopists also ventured into the realms of smell and taste. If a diagnosis couldn't be made by color, they would literally smell it, where a stinky odor usually pointed to an infection. And yes, the final resort was the taste test. As incredibly gross as this sounds to us today, there was actually a tiny sliver of validity to it. By tasting for sweetness, these medieval doctors actually successfully diagnosed conditions like diabetes. Of course, diagnosing diabetes back then was one thing. Actually curing it was completely out of their hands. So we've seen jobs for the desperately poor, the young, and the medically curious. But what happens when you have more money than you could possibly spend in 50 lifetimes? What did the ultra-wealthy do in the 1700s when they got completely bored of hunting, racing horses, and throwing opulent balls? Section 5. Human lawn ornaments, better known as the garden hermits. In the 18th century, wealthy landowners in Britain decided to abandon those formal, rigid French-style gardens for natural English landscapes. But some decided nature just wasn't enough. They wanted human beings as organic decorations. Take wealthy banker Joseph Pawkington, for example. He built an artificial cave on his estate and straight up hired a man to live in it. The contractual demands were strict, to say the least. The man had to live there for 7 years without ever washing or cutting his hair or nails. And he was completely forbidden from speaking to any of the guests. The whole point was just for wealthy visitors to observe a man in his natural state, entirely untouched by society. If he survived the 7 years, he'd earn the modern equivalent of about $100,000. Not all estate owners were quite this cruel, though. The Hill family in Shropshire employed Father Francis, a garden hermit who was actually allowed to interact with guests, tell stories, and dispense wisdom. Still, this baffling trend of keeping a pet hermit in your backyard lasted all the way until the 1830s. From sprinting 1,700 miles across an empire to sitting unwashed in a rich man's fake cave, history is packed with roles that were once incredibly essential, but are now entirely obsolete. So let me leave you with this provocative thought. As technology continues to rapidly evolve right before our eyes, which of our very serious, very important modern jobs do you think will look completely ridiculous to people living 200 years from now? Take a moment to really think about that, and I'll catch you in the next explainer.